Okay, I'm Thryn. I'm a designer on Google Photos. And if you are not familiar with Google Photos is a Photos app, and Google Photos has many features powered by machine learning, and this allows us to do really awesome things with your photos, like automatically organize them and bring them to life with fun creations, and make it easy for you to share and save what matters to you. Now, I take a lot of pictures. From the time I got my first digital camera to when I adopted my cat, I was taking around 2,000 pictures a year. And then when I had my first kid, it doubled to around 4,000 pictures a year. And now I'm approaching around 6,000 pictures a year. And I'll be honest with you, this is just the photos that I keep. This doesn't actually include any of the photos that I reject and delete. So you can imagine how excited I was to work on a product that I use and love. And what I love is that Google Photos helps bring my photos to life in truly magical ways, like showing me how my kids have grown up, my son Lion and my daughter Sapphire, or making fun GIFs out of my photos and videos. Now, I've been a designer for some number of years, and I've been a parent for about 4.5 years. And I'll be honest with you, at least for me anyways, parenting is a lot harder than design. And sometimes at the end of a really long day filled with lots of baby tears and maybe a few of my own tears, I'll get a creation like this, and it'll help me forget maybe a long, hard day of parenting where Sapphire was throwing a tantrum because she wanted to eat an orange, and then I gave her an orange, and then she was eating the orange, and it was in her mouth, and she didn't want it in her mouth. You know how it goes with toddlers. So as I started to learn more about our users and dove into the technology, I was just really in awe at the scale of things. We have 1.2 billion photos uploaded to Google Photos every day. That's a lot of pictures from people all over the world. And as we continue to build a stronger product and to grow, we have a lot on our mind beyond just the features that we're building. We're really aiming to make a product that works well for all of our users and that our roadmap reflects the needs of every user. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. What is inclusive design? How to seek diverse perspectives from your users, how to achieve fairness in machine learning, how to build and test for everyone, and building the mindset for inclusive design on your team. So one of the tenets in UX design is to optimize for the majority use case. But and this makes logical sense. In a world of finite resources, it makes sense to not waste engineering effort on edge cases but this can leave some users that are at the fringes, that are not in the majority, feeling left out in really hurtful ways. And what we really need to do is consider the needs of all of our users. Inclusive design is more than considering a user's physical or cognitive limitations. It's about understanding the diversity in our users, in their backgrounds, in their identities, in their ethnicities, in their situations. And it's about taking that information and using it to inform our product roadmap and all of our product decisions, so that we're not just designing, so we're designing for everybody, not just the majority. For example, if the majority of our users have high-end smartphones and fast, cheap data plans, like probably most of us here, it might not make sense to spend the engineering effort to increase our app's startup speed, make our app start up faster, or to reduce the app size. After all, why spend the engineering effort if only a few users are going to benefit from this feature? But it's our job as designers to consider who we might be excluding with that decision, who we might be leaving out. For example, users in emerging markets, or users in rural areas, or someone who simply can't afford a new smartphone or a bigger data plan. It's not really fair to leave these users out. So one thing that we've worked on photos is we've developed a set of product inclusion guidelines. And these guidelines help us to identify potential risks in our designs and our product decisions, to look for unanticipated consequences, and to give us guidance on how to address them. Now, there's still a work in progress, we're still iterating, but this is one helpful tool that helps guide our decisions. So the first part of inclusive design is to seek diverse perspectives. You may be familiar with this famous quote that designers and product geniuses often use as an excuse not to talk to their users. But I have some bad news for you if you're a fan of this quote. First, there's no evidence that Henry Ford actually said this. If as a heavy photos user myself, if I were to design photos based on my own needs, there would be some pretty huge blind spots. I think that's pretty obvious. But even with our large product team, we can't assume that we can understand and address the needs of all of our users. We have to talk to them. But it's more than just talking to our users. It's critically important that we seek out diverse household incomes, race, gender, ethnicities, geographic location, and include these people in our design process. We need to involve people in the design process who are going to bring diverse insight and challenge our own biases. So one way we do this on photos is we do field research in different locations. And this allows us to immerse ourselves in the culture of our users and understand how photos fits into their lives. We talk to our users to build empathy and understand their needs. For example, our research in Brazil helped to highlight the need for better language localization. And by talking to users in Germany and Spain, we better understood how our users feel about privacy. With photos, a user's journey doesn't begin when they open the app. It begins when they see a moment that they want to capture. And we want to bring value to that moment for years to come, whether it's in the form of a fun creation or a photo book or a shared album. And we want to have lasting positive impact. So, like many products built in the last few years, many features in Photos are powered by machine learning. And ML fairness is a pretty deep topic, and it can get pretty technical. I'm not going to get too much into the technical detail, but there are a few important considerations for the designer. So in machine learning, computers learn solutions by looking for patterns in data. And when we teach a computer, we can end up exposing it to our own biases. For example, with latent bias, where the computer learns from historical data, and this data might be incomplete or misrepresentative or biased itself. Or interaction bias, where the computer learns from data that comes from humans interacting with the system, and those humans may bring their own biases. Or selection bias, where the computer learns from a too narrow set of data. So this is why it's critically important for us to consider not only where our data comes from and how it's collected, but also how we train our models. Otherwise, we run the risk that our models won't work very well for underrepresented groups. So to illustrate this, let's, of course, look at pictures of cats. So if we have a model and we're trying to recognize cats and we only train it on pictures of orange tabby cats, and then we show the computer a picture of a Cornish Rex with its big eyes and oversized ears and curly little whiskers, how can we expect the computer to know that this is a cat? Do we want a model that recognizes all kinds of cats or only the most popular breeds of cats? How do you think this cat would feel if we told him, sorry, you're not a cat? We need to train our models to recognize all breeds of cats, not just one or two. It's also important to give special consideration to errors. With machine learning outputs, there are basically 4 kinds of outputs. And this is an area where it's really important to evaluate fairness and understand, and this means understanding your particular use case and how it might impact the user when the model gets it wrong. So to illustrate these types of errors, let's look at the search results for my cat cupcake school bus. and in particular, these two pictures that were included in the search results. And if you haven't figured out by now, this talk is really just a thinly veiled excuse to show you pictures of my cats. So, looking at this picture on your right, I think, right? On your right, this is not Cupcake. This is another adorable kitten, but this was included in the results, so this is called a false positive. And looking at the picture on the left, this is Cupcake School Bus, and this was included in the results, so this is called a true positive. Now let's look at two pictures that were not included in the search results. So this picture on the right, this is Cupcake, and so it should have been included in the results, so this is called a false negative. And this picture, well, this is my other cat, Linus, and this one shouldn't have been included in the results, and of course, it wasn't, so this is called a true negative, which incidentally is also Linus's personality. So this breakdown of errors is called the confusion matrix, and I agree, to someone just becoming familiar with this can feel pretty confusing. But this is an area where it's really important to evaluate fairness. For example, do the errors in your model affect all users equally, or are some user groups affected more by these errors? And it's also important to understand the impact of the errors on individual people. Like, for example, getting a suggested photo book of a dog diary with pictures of Linus, it's kind of silly, but it's not ultimately that harmful for me. Although I think that Linus would be pretty offended to be mislabeled as a dog, especially if he found out that only black and white cats were mislabeled as dogs very often and not calico cats like Cupcake. Or having my daughter's face identified as a foot and then getting suggestions to share to that foot. This is pretty intrusive, and especially since this suggestion was literally appearing on every photo of her for a while. Now, she's only 2, but I think she might be offended if she knew what was going on and that her Google Photos was identifying her face as a foot. And this automatically generated panorama of my friend Matt that cut off his legs. I mean, this was pretty fantastic, I'll admit it. I was laughing for days. But not all users are the same, and what could be a moment of delight for one user might be a moment of sadness for someone else. Photos are a really personal thing to many people. They're the most important thing in people's lives. And this means we need to be especially sensitive to situations that that are unique to a photos-based product, like surfacing unwanted pictures of an ex, because our algorithms don't know that you broke up. And some of our mistakes can be truly upsetting. Looking at error rates alone, this might be a rare use case. Looking at error rates alone, this might be a rare use case, a rare situation, but it's important not to look at the metrics or the statistics and look at the user stories behind them. This user was clearly upset about this and didn't really understand why this was happening. So it's important to remember that an algorithm is not always the right answer, and we need to ultimately give users control over their own experience, like in this case where you can hide faces so that they won't appear in your creations or in your Rediscover This Day memories, for example. Or being able to directly correct mistakes that our algorithms make, like confirming that this face is actually Sapphire, even though our algorithms weren't able to detect it, probably because she was all red-faced and teary from being mid-tantrum. So ultimately, we want to give our users the control because it's important to strike a balance between the magic of machine learning and the ability for users to have control over their experience so that everyone is able to have a positive experience with photos. So now that you have talked to your users and built something really cool that treats all of your users fairly and equitably, it's important to see if, now's the time to see if what you've built is ready for the world. But it's not time to celebrate or high-five each other yet, because there's still actually quite a lot of work to do. Building for everyone also means testing for everyone. So in UX, we talk a lot about edge cases. But I want to be careful with the term edge case, because an edge case is the way a real person is experiencing your product. In a way, edge cases define the limits of what we care about. And as important as it is to seek diverse perspectives and insights when informing your product roadmap and exploring designs, it's also important to test for different circumstances, even if those circumstances are rare and only experienced by a few users. On Photos, every feature we launch is rigorously tested by our teams on all of these different dimensions. And whenever possible, we also look at the data to see if any of these situations are being disproportionately experienced by certain user groups and why. For example, if we're launching a feature to improve a photo's quality, such as auto color correction or white balance correction, it's really important to make sure that this feature works equally well across all skin and fur colors. Because everyone should be able to see the benefits of this feature. This is hard work, but it's really important. It's some of the most important work that we do. Every kitten should be able to have their photos corrected, regardless of the color of their fur. Even the small details matter. These inclusive illustrations mean that everyone can see themselves represented here, and it doesn't exclude people like same-sex couples or multiracial families. Sometimes this means making tough calls. When we test a feature, we reach out to diverse networks to get feedback. And if we don't get enough feedback, we recently had to decide to pull a feature and not launch it because we hadn't gotten enough input from our target user group. And this feature was based on an annual holiday, and we decided that it was better to hold the feature until next year rather than launch it with the risk that it doesn't perform well. And part of defining success for your feature or product is also defining non-goals and guardrails. As we talked about earlier in the day, I think we all agree it would be a pretty bad idea if we were all glued to our devices 24 hours a day. So this means being careful about setting success metrics like engagement without also considering well-being. So the process and tools that I've shared here are important, but you're not going to get very far without the right mindset. And this mindset needs to be shared across your whole product team. Everyone on the team needs to believe that this is important work and that it's also achievable. It's our responsibility to design products that work well for everyone and leave a positive impact on the world. This is really hard work, and it's important to recognize that challenge. I wish that I could tell you that there is a single one-point solution that addresses all of the risks while maximizing all of the possible opportunities. But that's not true. There's no magic bullet. And that's why it's important to think of this more as a process and a mindset rather than a problem to solve or a task to complete. It'll feel like a hard, bumpy road at first, but as you talk with your product team and you build this into your regular design and development process, it's going to feel more familiar and become easier over time. Once upon a time, the design industry had the tough job of convincing the world that usability matters. And we've come a long way from then. Some products further along than others, but the next frontier for us as design practice is to go beyond usability and ensure that the products that we build work well for everyone and they're inclusive and fair to all of our users, no matter who they are or where they've come from. So thank you for listening to my talk, and if you want more cat pictures, you're welcome to follow Linus and Cupcake on Instagram. Thank you.